Hi guys, tonight we begin a quiet journey into one of the strangest places hidden by the Soviet Union, an island so secret and so dangerous that ordinary maps did not mark it. Some say it was a testing ground, others whisper it was a place where experiments left the soil glowing faintly at night. Few outside official circles ever spoke of it, and even today the details remain shrouded in mystery. As you settle in, let's drift back to the early Cold War years, when the Soviet Union guarded its most forbidden secrets behind walls of silence and water. If you appreciate calm, reflective journeys through forgotten times, don't forget to tap like, subscribe, and share in the comments where you're watching from. I always enjoy seeing where these stories are reaching, and tell me, what hidden story should we uncover together next? The story begins with geography, because in the Soviet mind, location was everything. An island, isolated by stretches of cold sea, offered natural protection. It was far from prying eyes, unreachable by casual travellers, and harsh enough to keep the curious away. Officials could say the area was restricted for defence purposes, a phrase vague enough to discourage questions, but precise enough to justify tight security. For those living on the mainland nearby, the island was more rumour than reality. Fishermen knew the waters around it, but avoided sailing too close. Military patrol boats enforced invisible lines across the sea, and the silence surrounding the place made it seem like a blank spot in daily life. From a distance, the island appeared ordinary, covered in forests and rocky shores, but the activity within was anything but normal. Ships carrying supplies arrived at odd hours, and no one disembarked unless cleared by armed guards. Supplies were unloaded under cover of night, and even the sound of engines was kept to a minimum. Local villagers spoke of faint lights glowing across the water long after midnight, lights that didn't move like lanterns or fishing boats. These small glimpses fueled imagination, but no one dared to ask directly. Inside the island, structures began to rise, low concrete bunkers, warehouses, and towers that bristled with antennas. The Soviets believed in building quietly, shaping the land into a fortress where research could proceed without interruption. At the heart of this development was nuclear science, a discipline already changing the shape of global politics. The island's isolation made it an ideal place to test theories and conduct experiments with minimal risk of public exposure. What happened there was described only in classified files, but the atmosphere of secrecy was so intense that even workers brought in for construction rarely understood what they were building. They were transported under supervision, lodged in barracks, and rotated out quickly before they could form too many questions. Those who worked longer spoke of fatigue, of the strange tension in the air, as though the very ground carried a quiet hum. Rumours circulated of protective gear being issued suddenly without explanation, and of workers being told not to drink the island's water. Medical checks were frequent, more frequent than ordinary factory life. Yet the official line remained simple. The island was for defence, nothing more. In the Soviet Union of the 1950s, questioning authority could be more dangerous than radiation itself. Families of those who worked there were told to expect silence from their relatives, and silence they received. Letters home were censored, often bland to the point of emptiness, describing only the weather or generic greetings. To outsiders, the island might as well have been another planet. Its very existence represented the deeper pattern of Cold War secrecy, a pattern where truth was buried under layers of necessity and fear. Tonight, as we set out on this long journey together, we'll walk step by step through the hidden corridors of this forbidden island, uncovering the traces left behind, the people who lived in its shadow, and the enduring silence that still surrounds it. The island's story continued to unfold as the 1950s deepened into an age of nuclear competition. By then, the Soviet Union had already detonated its first atomic device, but the arms race demanded constant progress. The Forbidden Island became a hidden laboratory, where theories drawn on chalkboards in Moscow turned into practical trials. For the scientists assigned there, the journey began with secrecy oaths signed in dim offices. They left their families without saying where they were going, and boarded unmarked trains that carried them toward distant coasts. From there, military boats transported them across grey seas, depositing them onto shores that felt more like a military outpost than a place of science. Barracks were stark, food was rationed, and freedom of movement was nearly non-existent. Every step was recorded, every conversation could be overheard. Yet within these boundaries, work pressed on. Nuclear research demanded precision and courage, because even small mistakes carried deadly weight. The laboratories were simple but functional, fitted with heavy lead doors and reinforced glass windows. Experiments with uranium and plutonium were carefully monitored, though in those years, safety protocols were still primitive compared to later standards. Dosimeters clicked faintly as men and women in lab coats performed their calculations, balancing scientific ambition against invisible risks. Outside, soldiers patrolled narrow roads, and construction crews continued to expand the island's hidden infrastructure. A small dock grew into a guarded port, and warehouses multiplied like grey cubes against the forest. Generators hummed steadily, filling the night air with a low vibration that unsettled new arrivals. The sound never truly stopped, a constant reminder that the island existed for a purpose larger than any individual. Life here was not only about work. Isolation shaped every waking hour. Letters home took weeks to arrive, if they arrived at all. Radios were limited, tuned mostly to official broadcasts. Conversations during mealtimes often circled around the same topics. Rumours of other projects, speculation about breakthroughs, quiet doubts never spoken too loudly. For young scientists, it was a test of endurance, not just knowledge. For soldiers, it was duty performed without question. Yet despite the monotony, there were glimpses of awe. Watching a reactor core flicker to life, or hearing the deep thrum of experimental machinery, gave a sense of standing at the edge of human power. The Forbidden Island was not simply a prison of silence. It was also a gateway into the unknown, where the mysteries of the atom revealed themselves in faint blue glows and measured heat. Still, unease never left the place. Animals avoided the shoreline, fish sometimes floated lifeless near the docks, and workers complained of sudden fatigue. Whispers grew that the island itself was changing under the pressure of human ambition. But in the Soviet Union, questions had little room to breathe. Silence was safer, and so the island remained both a workplace and a secret, locked tightly away from the world beyond. By the early 1960s, the Forbidden Island had grown into something resembling a self-contained city, though it never appeared on official maps. New barracks lined the forest edges, laboratories stretched into underground tunnels, and observation towers scanned the horizon day and night. The Cold War was reaching its peak, and with it came the pressure to keep pace with American advances in nuclear weapons and energy. For Moscow, the island symbolized both secrecy and control. Supplies were delivered under cover of darkness, brought in by ships whose schedules never followed a public timetable. Even the crew members often had little knowledge of what they carried. Crates marked with numbers rather than names were unloaded and moved into warehouses where guards watched silently. Inside, scientists experimented with materials whose dangers were only partially understood. Protective suits and gloves were worn, yet stories circulated of sudden illnesses among workers, unexplained fevers, or hair falling out too quickly. Official reports minimized these cases, calling them temporary fatigue or seasonal sickness. But those who lived on the island sensed something deeper. Life on the island developed its own rhythm. The workday began with roll call, continued through long hours in laboratories or monitoring stations, and ended with evenings of enforced quiet. Leisure was limited. Books passed from hand to hand, a few board games, occasional films approved by military officials. The soundscape of the island was unique. The mechanical hum of generators, the faint echo of waves, and the sharp crackle of Geiger counters. The combination gave residents the feeling that the island itself was alive, breathing in steady mechanical pulses. Isolation had psychological effects. Some newcomers struggled with insomnia, describing dreams filled with flashes of light or a sense of drowning in silence. Others became withdrawn, speaking little, as if words carried risk. Yet bonds formed too. between scientists who trusted one another with small confidences, or between guards who shared the burden of long night shifts. Occasionally permission was granted for short boat trips to the mainland. These excursions were tightly controlled, but even a few hours away from the island felt like freedom. Returning, however, always carried a weight, as though stepping back into a sealed world where time moved differently. The local villagers across the water still wondered about the glow that sometimes appeared above the trees at night, or the distant rumble like thunder on clear evenings. For them, the island remained untouchable, a forbidden silhouette that shaped their imaginations. Rumours of accidents filtered back slowly, never confirmed but never denied. They spoke of sudden evacuations, of areas cordoned off without explanation, of ships leaving with fewer crew than they had arrived with, yet nothing reached newspapers, and nothing was admitted officially. The Forbidden Island continued its quiet existence, expanding piece by piece, an invisible chapter in the larger story of nuclear ambition. Those who lived there rarely spoke after leaving, their silence enforced not only by oaths, but also by the haunting weight of memory. As the Cold War shifted into the later 1960s, the Forbidden Island had matured into a place where science and secrecy coexisted uneasily. It was no longer just a cluster of bunkers and laboratories, but an entire complex dedicated to exploring the power of the atom. Underground chambers housed experimental reactors, their heavy doors opening into spaces lit by harsh fluorescent lights. Here, researchers monitored gauges and dials that flickered constantly, recording the invisible currents of radiation. Some days passed without incident, but others were marked by sudden alarms, red lights flashing, and workers hurriedly donning protective gear. Few outside the island ever heard of these moments. Records were sealed, accidents erased from official memory, and those affected were often transferred quietly to mainland hospitals. For the residents, these events were both terrifying and routine. They spoke little of them, because in their world silence meant survival. Above ground, the island carried a deceptive calm. Pine trees swayed in the wind, seagulls circled the shore, and waves broke softly against the rocks. To an outsider, it could have seemed peaceful, almost idyllic. Yet beneath the soil lay buried waste, discarded experiments, and traces of radiation that no one dared to measure openly. The military presence remained constant. Patrols marched along narrow roads, their boots echoing against the concrete. Watchtowers kept a steady eye on both sea and sky, scanning for intruders who never came. The island's location was both blessing and curse, distant enough to hide its purpose, but also lonely, cut off from the wider world. Inside the barracks, life followed strict routines. Meals were simple, eaten under the gaze of officers who ensured order. Conversations drifted cautiously, touching only safe topics. The scientists tried to maintain a sense of normalcy by discussing theory or sharing fragments of literature, but the shadow of secrecy always lingered. Even laughter seemed muted, as though the island itself absorbed sound. Visitors from Moscow arrived occasionally, usually in groups of officials dressed in plain uniforms. Their presence brought tension, for it often signalled new directives or reviews. These visits were brief, and afterward the atmosphere grew heavier, with new rules imposed or new areas declared off-limits. The island's workers learned to adapt quickly, knowing that questioning orders invited scrutiny. By night, the glow of laboratories reflected faintly in the clouds, a pale reminder of the experiments continuing even as most residents tried to sleep. Dreams were restless, filled with images of fire, water, and silence. Some described hearing a constant ringing in their ears, as if the air itself vibrated with unseen energy. Though unspoken, many sensed that the island was slowly shaping them, leaving marks that would never entirely fade. Yet leaving was rarely an option. Assignments lasted years, and transfers required approval that came only after loyalty was proven. For most, the Forbidden Island was not just a workplace, but a chapter of life that consumed them wholly, binding their memories to a place the world was never meant to know. The island in the 1970s had become a place of contradictions. On one hand, It symbolized the peak of Soviet determination, a living fortress where nuclear science advanced behind guarded fences. On the other, it was a reminder of fragility, where the invisible weight of radiation hung in the air like mist. By then, the island's infrastructure was sprawling, concrete corridors running beneath the ground, reinforced hangars built to withstand explosions, and observation bunkers pointing toward the sea. For those assigned there, the journey felt endless. Weeks blended together, days marked less by calendars and more by routines. Early morning roll calls, long hours inside laboratories, evenings spent under dim lights in crowded barracks. The isolation worked quietly on the mind. Many spoke of time moving differently, as if the island existed outside the rest of the world. News arrived late, filtered through official channels. Births, deaths, even wars could feel like distant echoes, detached from their sealed environment. Yet within, life persisted. Workers developed quiet rituals. Some carved small objects from scrap wood. Others wrote journals that would never be published. Music occasionally played from old radios, its sound drifting softly through the halls like a reminder of another life. Outside, nature adapted strangely. Trees near testing zones showed twisted growth, leaves heavier on one side than the other. Birds sometimes avoided entire patches of forest, leaving sections eerily silent. Fishermen across the water noticed changes too. Fish that glowed faintly under moonlight, or sudden die-offs along the shore. Whispers spread in nearby villages, though no one dared to ask questions. Officially nothing was wrong. Unofficially everyone sensed otherwise. For the military, discipline was absolute. Guards rotated shifts, patrolled with precision, and spoke little of what they saw. Some admitted later that the island frightened them more than foreign enemies. The silence, the hum of machines, the strange behaviour of animals. It all suggested forces beyond control, yet their orders were clear: protect the island, no matter the cost. Inside laboratories, experiments pressed forward. Scientists studied new reactor models, explored novel fuels, and monitored long-term effects. Some were proud of their contributions, believing they were safeguarding their country. Others struggled quietly with doubt, especially when colleagues fell ill. Fatigue, headaches, and unexplained weakness became common. Medical officers recorded symptoms carefully, but rarely shared results. For those living there, the line between health and sickness blurred, just as the line between truth and secrecy dissolved. The Forbidden Island stood as both guardian and prisoner, holding within it the unspoken costs of ambition. By the late 1970s, the island's existence had become an unspoken truth among those who lived in its shadow. The mainland villages nearby knew not to sail too close. Children were told never to ask about the strange lights at night, and local officials avoided even mentioning its name. Maps still left the area blank, as if pretending it did not exist could erase its reality. Yet the island was busier than ever. Trucks rolled off ships under guard, their tyres crunching over gravel roads that led to hidden storage sites. Inside those crates were the materials of a secret empire: uranium, heavy shielding plates, and delicate instruments wrapped in layers of canvas. The laboratories expanded underground, growing into a maze where only a few knew every corridor. Rumours circulated of new projects, not just weapons, but energy systems designed to run without outside supply for years. The island was a workshop of extremes, balancing the dream of limitless power with the nightmare of contamination. Workers assigned there felt the pressure constantly. They spoke in low voices, avoided speculation, and focused on tasks with mechanical precision. Mistakes were dangerous, not only for careers but for survival. Radiation was invisible, and its effects often delayed. A cough that lingered, a burn that did not heal, or sudden weakness could all mean exposure, yet questions rarely brought comfort. Official answers were vague, emphasizing dedication and sacrifice. For the Soviet leadership, secrecy was a shield stronger than steel. Isolation was not only physical but psychological. the island seemed to draw a curtain around itself, muffling sound, muting emotion. Even friendships were shaped by silence. Trust developed slowly through shared routines and small acts of kindness, passing an extra piece of bread, covering a shift, or listening without judgment. Still, many carried loneliness like an invisible weight. The surrounding sea reinforced the sense of distance. Storms rolled in quickly, shrouding the island in fog. On such nights, the glow from laboratories cast strange halos through the mist, making the shoreline appear ghostly. To those watching from the mainland, it looked unnatural, a reminder that human ambition was reshaping nature itself. Fishermen whispered of poisoned waters, of nets that came back empty, of fish with pale, glassy eyes. They never complained openly. Fear of drawing attention was stronger than hunger. Within the island, officials maintained strict order. Reports travelled upward, stripped of emotion, written in clinical language. What lay between the lines, the fatigue, the doubts, the accidents, remained unwritten. The island's forbidden purpose endured, hidden behind silence, guarded by loyalty, and carried forward by people who rarely spoke of what they truly felt. The 1980s brought new urgency to the Forbidden Island. The world beyond its shores was shifting. Nuclear treaties were debated, rivalries deepened, and technology advanced at a pace that demanded constant adaptation. For the Soviet Union, the island remained a hidden stage where experiments unfolded far from international eyes. New facilities were built deeper underground, with reinforced walls and elaborate ventilation systems. These tunnels stretched like veins beneath the surface, connecting laboratories, storage chambers, and monitoring stations. Above ground, the island looked unchanged. Forests, rocky coasts, and guard towers that blended with the horizon. But within, the hum of machinery grew louder, the glow of equipment brighter. The scientists assigned during this decade were often younger, graduates of state universities eager to prove themselves. They arrived with determination, believing they were serving history, yet quickly learned the heavy silence of the place. Curiosity was discouraged, ambition narrowed to approved tasks. They worked long hours calculating reactor stability, measuring radiation leaks, or testing new shielding materials. Errors were met not with open discussion, but with quiet removal. A missing face at the dining hall said more than any official notice. Soldiers, too, carried the burden of vigilance. Patrols grew stricter, checkpoints multiplied, and the sense of watching and being watched became constant. Even in the barracks, conversation stopped abruptly when footsteps approached. Still, bonds formed in subtle ways. A cigarette shared in the cold, a song hummed under breath, a rare smile across the dining table. These small human moments kept the island from dissolving into pure machinery. Nature, however, continued to reveal strange changes. Trees nearest to disposal sites sometimes shed bark unnaturally, revealing twisted layers beneath. Birds abandoned certain areas, creating zones of silence where even the wind seemed reluctant to pass. Fishermen across the water reported glowing patches at sea, as if something beneath stirred. They avoided those waters, but their stories spread quietly, shaping local folklore. For villagers, the island was no longer just forbidden. It was cursed, a place where unseen forces dwelled. Meanwhile, officials in Moscow remained focused on results. Reports emphasized progress, breakthroughs, and efficiency. The hidden costs, fatigue, illness, unease, were left between the lines. Those who served on the island carried those costs silently, returning to the mainland years later with memories they rarely shared. To them, the island was not just a workplace, but a shadow, one that followed them long after they left. By the mid-1980s, the Forbidden Island seemed to exist in two realities at once. To the outside world, it was invisible, erased from maps, spoken of only in whispers. To those within its fences, it was an all-encompassing universe, where each day carried the same rhythm of silence, work, and guarded routines. The facilities were now vast, stretching across the island's length. Underground reactors pulsed steadily. their heat vented through disguised shafts. Storage sites held canisters marked with codes known only to specialists. Soldiers guarded each zone with quiet discipline, aware that even they did not fully understand what they were protecting. Scientists recorded measurements, logged results, and submitted them in carefully worded reports, stripped of personal thought. They were expected to serve as instruments of progress, not voices of doubt. Yet the human side of the island was harder to erase. Illness spread quietly, unacknowledged by officials but noticed by everyone. Some workers grew pale, coughing persistently, while others complained of constant fatigue. Medical staff issued tonics and advice but never explanations. Silence was the cure for questions. The barracks reflected this atmosphere. Evenings were filled with subdued conversations, whispers about home, or the rare exchange of stories meant to lighten the weight of secrecy. Radios played state broadcasts, voices that sounded distant and unreal compared to the hum of machines outside. Time itself felt altered. Seasons passed, marked by snow piling against fences or summer storms sweeping across the sea, but the routines remained unchanged. To those living there, it felt as if the island existed outside the natural flow of history. Beyond its shores, the Soviet Union was moving toward upheaval, though few inside could sense it. Locals across the water still spoke of strange phenomena. The glow above the trees at night, the taste of metal in the air, the silence of forests where birds refused to land. Children invented tales of ghosts on the island, warning each other never to wander near the shore. Their parents said nothing, for they too feared attracting attention. Within Moscow, the island was mentioned only in coded briefings, a subject hidden behind layers of secrecy. The truth of what it cost, the health of workers, the scars on nature, the silence of those who served, remained invisible, buried beneath numbers and reports. Yet for those who walked its corridors each day, the weight of that truth could not be forgotten. The Forbidden Island was more than a project. It was a place that etched itself into the body and mind, leaving marks that time could never fully erase. As the decade neared its end, the Forbidden Island entered a strange phase. The Soviet Union itself was beginning to tremble under the weight of economic strain and political change, but on the island the routines remained rigid, untouched by reform. Scientists still rose before dawn, marched to laboratories under watchful eyes, and spent long hours adjusting instruments or recording the faint hum of reactors buried beneath concrete. Soldiers still paced the same perimeters, rifles slung across their shoulders, watching seas that rarely brought intruders. Yet beneath this surface of control, cracks had begun to appear. Supplies sometimes arrived late, rations grew thinner, and equipment repairs were delayed. The once flawless machine of secrecy now carried small but visible flaws. Whispers spread among workers that funding was uncertain, that Moscow's priorities were shifting. For many, this uncertainty was more frightening than the silence they had endured for years. Illness also lingered, more difficult to hide as time passed. A cough that refused to leave, burns that healed too slowly, fatigue that clung to the body no matter how long one rested. These were not new, but by the late 1980s they became harder to ignore. People noticed the patterns, one colleague leaving suddenly for treatment, another returning thinner and quieter, some never returning at all. Officially nothing was wrong. Unofficially everyone knew the island carried a cost. Outside its fences nature bore scars as well. Certain coves no longer held fish, and patches of forest turned oddly pale, as if drained of life. Locals on the mainland avoided those shores, inventing superstitions to explain their caution. They spoke of cursed waters, of spirits guarding the island, anything but the truth that everyone quietly suspected. Within Moscow, reports grew shorter, reduced to numbers and progress updates. The human voices behind them, those who lived, worked, and suffered on the island, remained invisible. For the world outside, the island did not exist. For those within, it was everything. And as the 1980s drew to a close, both realities were about to collide. Change was coming, carried by the collapse of the state that had built this hidden world. But for now, the island remained locked in its routines, a place suspended in time, waiting for history to finally reach its shores. When the 1990s arrived, the Forbidden Island faced a future it had never been built to endure. The Soviet Union collapsed, and with it the steady flow of resources, orders and discipline that had sustained the island for decades. Suddenly, the once unshakable machine of secrecy was left adrift. Ships that once arrived on rigid schedules now came sporadically, carrying fewer supplies and fewer men. Barracks grew emptier, laboratories quieter, though the infrastructure remained. Rust began to creep along the edges of fences, paint peeled from watchtowers, and roads that once echoed with trucks fell silent. For those still stationed there, life turned uncertain. Soldiers spoke of being forgotten, their duties continuing but their purpose fading. Scientists too carried on their work, but many wondered if their results were even being read. Rumours spread of projects cancelled before completion, of files abandoned in locked cabinets, of experiments left half-finished in underground halls. The silence that had always been part of the island now deepened into something heavier, the silence of neglect. Nature slowly pressed its way back into the abandoned corners. Weeds grew through cracks in concrete, gulls nested on roofs, and storms battered empty warehouses. Yet the danger remained, because what lay beneath, the reactors, the waste, the sealed containers, did not vanish with politics. Radiation lingered, seeping invisibly into soil and sea, a reminder of the work once done here. Fishermen still avoided certain waters, locals still whispered of strange lights, and the island's reputation as cursed only grew. Within Russia, officials debated what to do. Some argued for dismantling the facilities, others for sealing them away, and still others preferred silence, hoping time would bury the past. But for those who had lived there, time could not erase the memories. They spoke little, bound by habits of secrecy, but their eyes carried the weight of years spent in a place where human ambition collided with natural limits. The Forbidden Island, once a guarded jewel of Soviet science, was now something else, a relic of a vanished state, a shadow left behind in the sea, holding dangers no one wished to claim, yet no one could forget. In the years after the Soviet collapse, the Forbidden Island entered a twilight existence. No longer powered by the constant rhythm of military shipments, it seemed to drift between abandonment and control. Some laboratories were sealed, doors welded shut, corridors left in darkness. Others remained active, manned by skeleton crews of scientists and soldiers who stayed out of duty, habit, or lack of choice. They worked in silence, surrounded by the remains of a once mighty system. Files gathered dust, instruments aged without replacement parts, and yet the hum of radiation still pulsed beneath the soil. The danger could not be abandoned. Containers of nuclear waste, buried hastily during busier years, remained in place. Some were intact, others weakened by rust, their seals uncertain. Storms washed across the island, flooding low ground, and locals whispered that the sea itself carried strange particles outward, invisible but present. Fishermen continued to avoid those waters, though they rarely explained why. In nearby villages, older residents told children never to wander near the forbidden zone, inventing tales of spirits or curses to disguise their knowledge. Officially, the island still did not exist. Maps avoided its outline, and government documents referred to it only in vague language, restricted territory, or closed site. Yet rumours persisted. Travellers reported seeing patrol boats even in lean years, their presence proof that the island had not been fully abandoned. Satellite images, when they finally became available to the public, revealed the outlines of roads, buildings and docks, confirming what had long been denied. For historians and researchers, the island became a puzzle, a symbol of Cold War secrecy hidden in plain sight. For those who had lived there, it was more than a puzzle. It was a place that had shaped their health, their memories, their very lives. Many former workers carried scars invisible to others, weakened bodies, sleepless nights, and a sense that part of them had never truly left. Some refused to speak of their time there at all, as though silence itself had followed them into freedom. The island remained, enduring storms, decay, and secrecy alike. It was no longer the fortress it had been, but neither was it free of its past. Instead, it stood suspended, a reminder of what had been built, what had been sacrificed, and what had been hidden away beneath layers of silence. As the 1990s turned into the new millennium, the Forbidden Island took on a new kind of life. Not one of growth, but of haunting persistence. Russia had changed. The Cold War was over, yet the island remained, still sealed away by water, still avoided by locals, still absent from most official records. Decay spread across its surface. Buildings sagged, windows shattered in storms, and rust-covered fences that once gleamed with fresh paint. But beneath, the hidden heart of the island continued to pulse. Reactors had long been shut down, but waste remained, sealed in barrels and casks buried in soil or stored within bunkers. Some were secure, others less so, their metal weakened by decades of exposure to salt air. Rainwater trickled through cracks, carrying invisible particles toward the sea. The natural world responded in strange ways. Fishermen who dared to cast nets nearby sometimes pulled up fish with pale, unnatural markings. Birds avoided nesting on certain cliffs, leaving empty stretches of rock where only the wind called. Forests grew uneven, with patches where trees twisted unnaturally or stopped growing altogether. The island seemed to bear scars, reminders of human ambition etched into its very soil. For those who once served there, memories lingered heavily. Interviews conducted quietly in later years revealed the same themes: silence, fear, a sense of being trapped within an experiment that stretched beyond science. Many described the sound of constant humming, the glow of equipment at night, the feeling that the island itself was alive with invisible energy. They carried illnesses and exhaustion long after leaving, but few spoke openly, bound not only by oaths of secrecy, but also by the weight of what they had endured. The government, now facing different challenges, treated the island as a legacy problem. Some discussions surfaced about clean-up, but funding was scarce and priorities shifted elsewhere. Official tours were rare, conducted only by specialists, and the findings were rarely shared publicly. In the absence of information, myths grew stronger. Stories spread of glowing light still visible from the mainland, of abandoned halls where machinery continued to run without human hands, of figures seen moving among the ruins at night. Whether true or not, these tales added to the island's aura, making it not only forbidden, but ghostly. For the new generation, it became a story told in whispers, a relic of a vanished empire, a place where the past refused to rest. The island remained locked in silence, half real, half legend, an unresolved chapter floating in the cold waters of the north. The early 2000s brought little change to the Forbidden Island. Russia was entering a new era, but the island remained as it always had, remote, sealed away, and cloaked in silence. Official statements about nuclear safety occasionally mentioned legacy sites, but rarely by name. For locals, the island was still taboo, a shadow visible across the water but never approached. Patrol boats continued to circle its shores, fewer than before but present enough to remind everyone that entry was forbidden. From a distance, the island looked abandoned, with collapsing roofs and rusting docks, but those who had once served there knew better. Beneath the ruins lay tunnels, storage halls, and sealed chambers where the past had not been erased. Radiation levels remained uneven, some areas deceptively safe, others dangerously high. Scientists who studied the region from afar described it as a patchwork of contamination, shaped by decades of hasty disposal and secret experiments. Nature pressed on in strange forms. Pines grew tall in some areas, but elsewhere the soil resisted life, leaving barren clearings surrounded by thick forest. Animals returned cautiously, though fishermen still reported odd catches: fish with translucent skin, crabs unusually large, or shells that carried faint glows under moonlight. Such reports were dismissed officially as exaggerations, but they echoed earlier whispers that the island had changed the natural order around it. Meanwhile, the human memory of the place continued to fade. Former workers aged, many passing away with their stories unspoken. Those who did speak often did so quietly, sharing recollections with family but avoiding outsiders. They described loneliness more than danger, the endless monotony of guarded days, the weight of secrecy heavier than any physical wall. For them, the island was not only a workplace but a prison of silence, one they carried with them long after leaving. Historians began piecing together fragments, using declassified documents, satellite images, and scattered testimonies. Yet the puzzle remained incomplete. Too many files had been destroyed, too many lives had ended without their voices recorded. The island resisted understanding, just as it had resisted intrusion for decades. In the popular imagination, it transformed into something larger than fact, a symbol of Cold War secrecy, of hidden dangers buried beneath oceans and forests. Whether seen as a cautionary tale or a ghost story, the Forbidden Island remained suspended between myth and reality, its true story still locked beneath layers of rust, concrete, and silence. By the mid-2000s, the Forbidden Island had taken on the air of a relic, half ruin, half threat. Russia's focus was on modernization, energy, and rebuilding influence, yet the island sat unchanged, a leftover from an age of secrecy. It was no longer the bustling fortress of the 1960s or the controlled machine of the 1970s. Instead, it seemed caught in suspension, its decaying infrastructure standing as silent testimony to ambitions that once consumed entire generations. Satellite imagery available to the public revealed the outlines of structures, fueling curiosity among journalists and researchers. From above, the pattern of roads, the scars of excavation, and the grids of warehouses were clear, confirming what locals had long whispered. Yet little was said officially, and access remained impossible. Patrols, though fewer, still discouraged intrusion. Signs on nearby coasts warned in blunt terms: restricted waters, no entry. For fishermen and villagers, these warnings were unnecessary. Fear was stronger than law. Few dared to sail near, remembering stories of engines that stalled mysteriously, or compasses that spun without reason. Some claimed to have seen lights glowing faintly at night, unnatural halos drifting above the trees. Others spoke of hearing sounds across the water, low mechanical hums carried on the wind long after the facilities had supposedly closed. Inside Russia, occasional debates emerged about cleanup. Environmental groups warned of contamination spreading silently, of waste buried too carelessly, of long-term risks to the sea itself. Officials responded with assurances but rarely with details. Funding was promised, then redirected. The island remained too costly to rehabilitate, too dangerous to ignore, and too embarrassing to admit fully. It existed in a grey zone, guarded by silence as much as by fences. For those who had lived there, memory carried on. Former soldiers spoke of endless patrols, of standing watch in storms with only the glow of laboratories for company. Scientists recalled long hours underground, where the air felt thick and the silence heavier than the walls. Many had suffered illness, but few linked it openly to their service. Secrecy was still a habit, even in freedom. In cultural memory, the island began to shift toward legend. Documentaries speculated, authors wrote novels set on its shores, and conspiracy theories flourished. Some imagined secret stockpiles still hidden there, others believed experiments had never stopped. Reality was simpler yet darker, a place built for power, left to decay, still carrying dangers that time could not erase. The Forbidden Island endured, not as a centerpiece of progress, but as a warning etched into the sea, a reminder that secrecy leaves marks deeper than concrete and steel. As the 2010s unfolded, the Forbidden Island stood as a quiet contradiction. Official voices insisted it was dormant, a sealed relic with no active role, yet its very secrecy kept it alive in the imagination of those nearby and those far away. Journalists attempted to gather information, but access was denied at every turn. Satellite photos revealed familiar outlines, crumbling docks, roads vanishing into forests, the shadows of large structures, but they could not show what lay underground. That uncertainty gave the island its power. Villagers across the water still spoke cautiously, avoiding direct words. They referred to it only as the place, or the zone, as if naming it might draw attention. Fishermen kept wide distances, steering their boats far around the invisible perimeter. Even when storms forced them closer, they would not cast nets, afraid of what they might pull from the depths. Rumours spread of animals behaving strangely, gulls circling endlessly in one spot, foxes crossing ice only to avoid entire sections of forest, fish surfacing suddenly before disappearing again. Scientists who studied environmental samples from nearby waters confirmed irregularities, higher levels of isotopes, traces of substances linked to nuclear waste, but their findings were often buried in obscure reports. For ordinary people, the island remained untouchable, more ghost than geography. Within Russia, debates about cleanup reappeared, sparked by environmental groups and younger generations who wanted transparency. Proposals were drafted to seal remaining waste, to dismantle old reactors, to monitor the coastline more carefully. Yet each proposal met the same fate: delays, excuses, and the reminder that money and manpower were limited. In the end, the island was left as it had always been, managed by silence. Those who once worked there were aging. Some began speaking more openly, giving interviews or writing memoirs. Their stories matched in tone, the strict routines, the unspoken fear, the sense of living inside a world that could not be explained to outsiders. They described the island not with anger, but with a weary acceptance. It had been part of their lives, shaping them in ways they could not forget. Illness shadowed many of them, but even then they avoided direct accusations. Secrecy had become second nature, woven into their voices. In popular culture, the island gained a new identity. Filmmakers hinted at it in documentaries, novels used it as a backdrop for mystery, and internet forums speculated endlessly about hidden stockpiles or experiments. Reality was far simpler yet more haunting. A decaying place carrying invisible dangers, its silence louder than any revelation. The Forbidden Island no longer shaped the future, but it continued to shape memory, standing as a monument to ambition, secrecy, and the shadows they leave behind. By the middle of the 2010s, the Forbidden Island had become a paradox, abandoned yet guarded, silent yet alive in the imagination of all who knew of it. The sea around it still carried warnings, with patrol boats appearing irregularly to remind outsiders that entry was forbidden. The presence of guards, even decades after its active years, raised questions. Why maintain such vigilance over ruins? The answer was rarely spoken but deeply felt. Danger lingered. Radiation was not bound by political calendars, and the island still carried traces of what had been buried, spilled, and sealed long ago. Visitors were nearly non-existent, limited to rare inspection teams who came quietly, stayed briefly, and left without public reports. For locals, these visits confirmed suspicions. Something on the island required attention, though the nature of it remained hidden. Over time, myths layered themselves upon fragments of truth. Stories told of laboratories where light still flickered at night, powered by forgotten generators. Others claimed to have seen shadows moving among the ruins, as if those who once worked there had never truly left. Such tales blurred the line between history and folklore, giving the island an aura not only of secrecy, but of haunting. Meanwhile, nature wove its own narrative. The forest grew thick across unused clearings, swallowing fences and pathways. Yet some areas resisted regrowth, patches of earth where nothing thrived. Storms reshaped the coastline, breaking down concrete and scattering fragments of steel into the sea. Fishermen still avoided the waters, and when they did pass, they whispered of unnatural silence, of compasses spinning erratically, of engines faltering without cause. To them, the island was not simply dangerous, it was cursed. Inside Russia, the island was rarely mentioned except in specialized circles. Environmental scientists pressed for monitoring, warning that abandoned waste could eventually leak further into surrounding waters. Officials responded cautiously, promising studies and reviews, but little action followed. Budgets were tight, priorities elsewhere. The island was both too dangerous to open and too costly to repair. Thus it remained in stasis, a ghostly reminder of another era. For those who once served there, growing older and more willing to speak, the memories surfaced in fragments. They described the weight of isolation, the constant hum of machines, the subtle fear of contamination that never left their minds. Some remembered colleagues falling ill, others recalled moments of quiet beauty, sunsets seen from watchtowers, friendships formed in silence. Their stories gave the island depth beyond secrecy. It was not only a place of science and danger, but also of human endurance. The Forbidden Island stood as both monument and warning, holding within it the silence of history and the scars of ambition. As the decade moved toward its end, the Forbidden Island remained a riddle that time refused to solve. It had outlasted the empire that created it, the Cold War that demanded it, and the secrecy that had once been absolute. Yet even as years passed, its shadow stretched across memory and imagination alike. From a distance, the island looked abandoned. Roofs sagged under snow, docks crumbled into the sea, and trees pressed through cracks in the pavement. But decay did not erase its danger. Underground chambers still held remnants of experiments, sealed barrels, and storage rooms filled with materials whose names were never written in public records. Radiation, though invisible, endured like a ghost bound to the soil. Inspectors who visited occasionally carried instruments that crackled faintly, even in areas thought to be safe. Their reports rarely surfaced, but the quiet urgency with which they left spoke volumes. On the mainland, locals continued to avoid its shores. For children, the island became a story told at night, a place of curses and phantoms. For adults, it was a reminder of things better left unspoken. Some recalled relatives who had worked there and returned changed. Quieter, weaker, carrying secrets they never shared. These memories blended into folklore, giving the island a place not only in history but in myth. In Russia's cultural landscape, it began appearing in books, films, and online discussions. Each account blurred fact and imagination, yet all carried the same undertone: fear wrapped in fascination. Some believed the island still concealed hidden stockpiles. Others suspected experiments had continued in silence, long after official closure. Few believed it was truly abandoned. Nature's changes deepened that suspicion. Certain zones of forest grew strangely, with trees bent in unnatural arcs. Animals skirted clearings, leaving them eerily empty. Fishermen still spoke of lights glimmering faintly above the water, though no electricity was known to flow there. Such signs, whether natural or not, reinforced the idea that the island was alive with forces beyond control. For historians, the challenge remained: how to uncover truth from silence. Declassified files revealed fragments but never the whole. Testimonies from aging workers offered details but always with gaps. The Forbidden Island resisted understanding, as if secrecy itself had seeped into its foundations. It stood as a monument not only to nuclear ambition, but to the silence that ambition demanded, a silence that still hangs over the cold waters and whispers to those who remember. The approach of the 2020s did little to change the Forbidden Island's fate. It remained off-limits, a stretch of land hidden behind the curtain of official silence, yet still visible to anyone who gazed across the water. The world had grown more open. Technology allowed images of almost any corner of the Earth to circulate, and yet this place held fast to its secrecy. Satellite photographs revealed outlines of decaying infrastructure, but they could not capture what lay beneath. That uncertainty kept the island alive in global imagination. Scholars speculated about its role, journalists wrote cautious articles, and online communities treated it as a mystery waiting to be solved. In Russia, however, the island was rarely acknowledged. Environmental groups continued to raise alarms, pointing to potential leaks and contamination that could threaten surrounding waters. Reports noted irregular isotope levels, evidence of aging storage, and the risk of storms breaching buried waste. Yet official responses remained vague. Promises of inspections, mentions of long-term monitoring, but little visible action. For locals, such ambiguity confirmed what they already believed, that the island still carried dangers no one wanted to admit. Their stories continued to shape folklore. They spoke of gulls that refused to land, of fish with unnatural markings, of nights when faint glows shimmered above the tree line. Parents warned children never to play near the shore facing the island, cloaking their fear in tales of spirits. Outsiders dismissed these stories as superstition, but those who lived nearby trusted experience more than denial. For former workers, the island lingered as memory. Many were elderly now, carrying illnesses they linked quietly to their years of service. Some gave interviews, describing routines, structures, and the constant pressure of secrecy. Their accounts matched in tone, the weight of silence, the monotony of guarded days, the subtle fear that every breath carried risk. They spoke without anger, often with resignation, as though the island had become part of them, etched into their bones. Historians pieced together these fragments, yet the full picture remained elusive. Too many files had been destroyed, too many voices lost. The island resisted clarity, standing as both a ruin and a riddle. In popular culture, it became a symbol of the Cold War's hidden costs, of ambition built on secrecy, and of the silence that still covers parts of history. The Forbidden Island endured as more than a location. It was a story unfinished, an echo from the past that still whispered across the sea. As the new decade unfolded, the Forbidden Island remained a paradox, silent yet never forgotten, abandoned yet never free. Its outline was still visible across grey waters, a reminder that secrecy has a longer life than any government decree. Officially little was said. Occasional references in bureaucratic reports spoke of restricted territories or legacy sites, vague words that revealed nothing. Yet the island's name surfaced more often in whispers, in documentaries hinting at mysteries, in online forums filled with speculation. For locals nearby, none of this was new. They had lived for generations under its shadow, watching the shoreline with caution. Their silence had hardened into tradition. Even as younger people questioned the truth, older voices urged restraint, repeating warnings never to sail close, never to cast nets near its waters, never to disturb what had been buried. Stories grew around those warnings. Some spoke of nights when lights shimmered above the treetops, glowing faintly before vanishing with the dawn. Others described strange sounds drifting across the sea. Low hums, mechanical pulses, whispers carried by the wind. Fishermen who strayed too near claimed their engines stalled without reason, only to restart once they drifted away. These accounts, impossible to prove, added to the aura of haunting. Scientists remained cautious. Some published studies noting higher levels of certain isotopes in surrounding waters, but their findings were often overshadowed by politics or dismissed as insignificant. The truth was simple yet alarming. Time had not erased what lay beneath. Containers rusted, soil shifted, storms struck with greater force. The risk was not gone, it had only changed shape. For those who once worked there, the island never left their lives. They spoke of it with a mixture of pride and unease, recalling the discipline, the routines, the sense of contributing to something larger than themselves. Yet beneath their words lay another truth, the fatigue that never vanished, the illnesses that followed them, the silence they had been trained to keep. Their memories gave the island a human face, a reminder that secrecy was lived, not just enforced. In the wider world, the island became a symbol. To some, it represented the dangers of unchecked ambition. To others, it was a mystery that demanded answers. But for those who had lived in its shadow, it was simply a fact of life, unseen, unspoken, yet always present. The Forbidden Island endured, standing as a monument not of victory but of questions left unresolved, a chapter of history still locked in silence. The Forbidden Island entered the 2020s as both ruin and riddle. Its cracked buildings and rusting fences spoke of abandonment, yet its guarded waters and invisible dangers told another story. Few places carried such weight without ever being openly named. Maps remained blank, official references rare, but the island's silhouette across the sea was unmistakable. Locals had grown used to living beside it, but habit did not erase fear. They warned newcomers quietly, saying little more than, "Don't sail near there." For them, the island was not only forbidden, it was alive, a presence that pressed against the horizon. Modern technology made glimpses easier. Satellite images, drone footage, and leaked reports surfaced online, showing broken docks, collapsed roofs, and forests creeping over old roads. Yet these pictures raised more questions than they answered. What lay underground, sealed behind concrete and steel, could not be photographed. That absence gave birth to speculation. Some believed hazardous waste was still leaking into the sea. Others suspected hidden stockpiles, sealed vaults of forgotten experiments. Whatever the truth, no one outside official circles knew for certain. Environmental scientists issued warnings with increasing urgency. Their studies suggested contamination spreading slowly, carried by currents into wider waters. Small abnormalities appeared in marine life: fish with unusual markings, shellfish with traceable isotopes. These findings reached scientific journals, but rarely the evening news. For governments, silence was easier than explanation. Meanwhile, myths deepened. Locals told of nights when faint lights glowed in the forest, or when strange humming sounds rolled across the sea like distant thunder. Children dared each other to look toward the island after dark, convinced they might glimpse figures moving among the ruins. Such tales blurred fact and imagination, but they kept the island's presence alive in the culture of nearby villages. For those who once lived there, now elderly, the memories returned often. They recalled the constant discipline, the endless routines, the silence heavier than walls. Some admitted to pride in their work, believing they had served their country in its moment of need. Others carried regret, sensing the cost not only in their own health, but in the scars left on nature. Their voices, scattered and incomplete, added depth to the island's story. It was not only a relic of the Cold War, but a reminder of how ambition can outlive its purpose, leaving behind shadows no one dares to claim. The Forbidden Island remained untouched, its silence both shield and warning, waiting for a future that might never come. By the early 2020s, the Forbidden Island had become a paradox of modern Russia, a relic of the past that refused to fade, and a danger that could not be fully ignored. Official statements still referred to it vaguely, if at all, using terms like closed zone or legacy site. For the outside world, those words meant little, but for those who lived nearby, they carried a weight of generations. The island was no longer a workplace, yet its shadow remained as heavy as when patrol boats first cut through its waters decades earlier. Villagers watched the horizon with quiet unease. They told stories not in anger but in resignation, as though the island was part of the natural order, like storms or tides. Fishermen still avoided certain routes, even when the sea was calm. They swore engines sputtered mysteriously near its borders, and nets thrown in those waters came back torn or empty. Parents taught children to respect the island, to never point toward it, to never speak its name loudly. These rituals became cultural habits, shaping lives as deeply as any official law. Scientists who studied from afar continued to sound alarms. Their reports noted increasing instability of old storage sites, erosion along the coastline, and isotopes measurable in marine samples far beyond the island's shores. They warned that storms, stronger each year, could breach what had once been thought secure. Yet little action followed. Bureaucracy slowed decisions, funding vanished into other priorities, and the problem remained unresolved. The silence of government matched the silence of the island itself. Meanwhile, the myths only grew louder. Tourists drawn by curiosity sometimes asked about excursions, but locals discouraged them with sharp words or uneasy laughter. "You don't want to go there," they would say. Legend spoke of glowing figures walking along the shoreline, of abandoned machinery still humming in the dark, of birds that circled but never landed. Whether invention or memory, these stories gave the island an aura of haunting. For those who once lived and worked there, the memories aged with them. Some shared fragments in interviews, describing cold nights in watchtowers, the taste of metallic air, the endless echo of machines underground. They spoke with a quiet mixture of pride and sorrow, aware they had been part of something immense yet damaging. Their accounts did not solve the mystery, but they gave it a human face. The Forbidden Island, once the secret heart of Soviet nuclear ambition, was now something else entirely. A monument to secrecy itself, a reminder of what happens when silence becomes stronger than truth. The Forbidden Island, though rarely named, still occupied a place in the quiet fabric of Russian life. To the authorities, it was a leftover liability. To the people nearby, it was an unspoken boundary. Boats steered wide around its waters, their captains unwilling to risk the unknown. Even in clear daylight, the outline of its forests and broken towers seemed heavy, as though the air above it carried a different weight. Locals described the sensation of being watched when they passed too close, a feeling that prickled the skin even without evidence. For them, the island was not just geography, it was presence. By now, decades of storms had scarred the landscape. Concrete cracked under frost, steel beams bent in the wind, and storage areas once sealed tightly now stood exposed. Grass grew in odd patterns, dense in some places, absent in others, as though the soil itself remembered. Animals returned cautiously. Deer crossed the island but never lingered. Birds circled overhead but avoided nesting. Fishermen, when pressed, admitted their catches still carried signs. Fish with pale marks, shells discoloured strangely, crabs larger than they should be. Such signs were dismissed publicly as exaggerations, yet they were consistent, repeated quietly across generations. Scientists continued to investigate, though often at a distance. Their instruments detected radiation spikes in narrow zones, enough to confirm the risk but not enough to explain it fully. They spoke of buried waste shifting with time, of containers weakening under pressure, of contamination bleeding slowly into surrounding waters. Their reports reached journals, but they rarely stirred public debate. The subject was too complex, too heavy, and too bound by silence. Meanwhile, stories grew. Locals spoke of nights when faint lights flickered among the trees, not like fires, not like lamps, but something otherworldly. Children dared each other to stare across the water after sunset, convinced they might glimpse shadows walking along the shore. These tales blurred fact and imagination, but they served a purpose. They kept people away. For those who once worked there, the island was not legend, but memory. They spoke of the strict routines, the unyielding silence, the weight of secrecy that followed them home. Many were elderly now, but their recollections carried the same quiet intensity. They did not describe drama or explosions. but the steady grind of a life lived in containment. To them, the island was less a place than a shadow, one that stretched across their lives long after they had left. And so the Forbidden Island endured, standing between history and myth, a place still alive with silence. By the mid-2020s, the Forbidden Island had become a paradox more striking than ever. On the surface it appeared forgotten, its docks falling into the sea, its fences bent and rusted, its towers standing like broken teeth against the horizon. Yet its silence drew attention in ways open places never could. The absence of news created curiosity, and curiosity gave birth to myths. Online forums debated endlessly. Some claimed the island still housed hidden stockpiles. Others insisted it was the site of secret modern experiments. Each theory reflected both fascination and unease. The truth, as usual, lay somewhere between silence and speculation. Scientists who monitored from a distance continued to raise concerns. Their measurements showed traces of isotopes in fish caught farther from the island than ever before. They warned of storms growing stronger, of rising seas eroding buried storage. Yet such warnings rarely reached the headlines. Officials spoke of long-term monitoring but avoided specifics, as though clarity itself might open doors best kept closed. For locals, nothing had changed. They still avoided the island, still spoke of it only in hints. Some admitted they dreamed of it, seeing lights flicker across its forests or hearing low vibrations carried across the water. Others treated it as background, a presence like the weather, constant and immovable. Fishermen still steered wide, convinced the waters were not safe. Parents still warned children never to look too long at its outline, as though attention itself could summon danger. Nature, meanwhile, continued its slow reclamation. Forests crept over cracked runways, moss softened the edges of bunkers, and gulls nested on towers once patrolled by armed soldiers. Yet signs of strangeness persisted. Certain trees bent unnaturally, patches of ground remained barren, and animals avoided sections that looked ordinary to human eyes. These details, small yet persistent, fueled the island's aura. For those who once lived there, memories resurfaced with age. They described the endless hum of machines underground, the strict silence of meals, the way the island seemed to strip away individuality. Some spoke of friendships forged in hardship, others of the loneliness that weighed heavier than any order. Their recollections were not dramatic but steady, like echoes from a chamber no longer in use. Together these voices reminded listeners that behind every myth was lived experience. The Forbidden Island was not only a Cold War relic, it was a human story etched into soil and memory alike. As time moved forward, its silence remained, asking questions no one seemed ready to answer. The Forbidden Island now lived in two worlds, one physical, one imagined. Physically, it was a decaying strip of land battered by wind and sea, its structures collapsing, its fences broken, its docks reduced to skeletons of steel. Imagined, it was vast and powerful, a symbol that carried the weight of secrecy into the present. People who had never seen it debated its nature. Those who lived near it avoided speaking its name. That dual existence kept it alive in ways more active places never managed. Silence created its own momentum. In the physical world, danger persisted. Containers buried decades earlier were aging, their seals vulnerable to storms and erosion. Underground tunnels, once designed to hold experiments, now collected water, their air heavy with damp. Scientists who reviewed satellite data warned of instability, landslides on the shoreline, cracks in the terrain, but their concerns rarely left technical papers. For governments, silence remained easier than admission. Myths filled that silence. Villagers spoke of shadows visible on the shore, of lights glowing through the trees, of animals behaving in ways that defied explanation. They said foxes walked the coastline but never crossed inland, that birds circled but refused to land, that fish surfaced suddenly only to drift lifeless. Children repeated these stories, reshaping them into ghost tales. Outsiders dismissed them, yet they matched whispers from decades earlier. The island's legend carried continuity, growing with each retelling. For those who once lived there, silence was habit. Many were old now, yet their memories surfaced in fragments. The clang of steel doors, the taste of metallic air, the feeling of being sealed away from the world. Some spoke of pride, others of regret, but all carried the weight of secrecy. Even when free to talk, they hesitated, as though the island itself still listened. Environmental groups pressed harder, calling the island a danger that could not remain ignored. They pointed to stronger storms, shifting seas, and the possibility of contamination spreading beyond control. Their voices grew louder, but action remained slow. The island was too costly to clean, too dangerous to forget, and too deeply tied to history to be discussed openly. In popular imagination, it became a stage for speculation. Books, films, and online theories each adding layers to its myth. Yet beneath those stories lay a simpler truth. The Forbidden Island endured, holding within it not only nuclear remnants, but also the silence of an era when secrecy defined power. That silence still draped across its waters, binding past to present. As years passed, the Forbidden Island became a paradoxical monument. It was no longer guarded with the same intensity, yet patrol boats still cut across its waters from time to time, enough to remind the curious that entry was forbidden. It was no longer the focus of great experiments, yet its silence suggested that some unfinished business remained sealed within its soil. The island had transformed from an active fortress into a memory made physical, a place where history lingered stubbornly against the tide of time. For locals, it remained a constant presence. They described it in whispers, their warnings passed from parents to children. "Do not sail near," they said, "and never point toward it." These words carried the weight of generations, an inherited fear that had become tradition. To outsiders, this silence sounded like superstition, but to those who lived beside it, it was wisdom born from experience. Too many strange signs had appeared over the years to dismiss. Nets cast too close sometimes came back empty, as if the sea itself had rejected intrusion. Birds avoided stretches of the forest, leaving eerie pockets of stillness. On stormy nights, villagers swore they saw faint glows above the tree line, lights with no source, flickering before vanishing into darkness. These observations became woven into folklore, making the island not only a forbidden zone but also a haunted one. Meanwhile, scientists continued their quiet studies. They measured isotope traces in the sea, noting levels that ebbed and rose with troubling irregularity. They described patterns of contamination that suggested slow leaks, the inevitable consequence of storage left unattended for too long. Their warnings, though written carefully, painted a clear picture. Time was eroding the island's secrecy. What had once been locked away was no longer fully contained, yet official voices spoke little, avoiding the subject as if words themselves carried risk. The island became a metaphor in broader discussions, a symbol of secrecy's long shadow. Writers described it as a ghost of the Cold War, a place where ambition and silence had collided. Filmmakers used it as inspiration, setting stories in landscapes of rust and fog. Online communities speculated endlessly, their theories ranging from abandoned stockpiles to experiments that had never ended. Reality remained less dramatic but more haunting, a contaminated relic left to decay, carrying dangers that would outlast those who created them. For former workers, memories sharpened with age. They spoke of monotony, of strict routines, of the way time lost its meaning within the island's fences. Their voices carried both pride and sorrow, revealing the human cost behind the secrecy. The Forbidden Island stood unchanged, a silent witness to their past and a warning for the future. By the late 2020s, the Forbidden Island had taken on the weight of legend as much as reality. To those nearby, it was simply part of the horizon, a shape across the sea that required no explanation. To those far away, it became a mystery worth chasing, a place that embodied the silence of the Cold War and the secrets that still lingered in its wake. Journalists tried to investigate, but access was impossible. Satellite images revealed patterns of decay, collapsed roofs, roads overtaken by forest, the skeletons of towers long unused. Yet none of these images could reveal what mattered most: the contents of tunnels and chambers beneath the surface. That absence allowed speculation to flourish. Environmentalists warned that waste stored decades earlier might be leaking into the sea, while conspiracy theorists claimed that experiments had never stopped. The truth, as always, was quieter but heavier. Inspections confirmed that buried containers were deteriorating, though few details reached the public. Specialists described zones of instability, areas where radiation levels spiked unexpectedly, and where nature itself showed resistance to recovery. Grass refused to grow in some patches, while in others plants flourished unnaturally fast. Such irregularities only deepened the island's aura of strangeness. For locals, folklore continued to frame their caution. They told stories of birds circling endlessly without landing, of foxes pacing along the shore as if searching for something unseen, of waters that sometimes glowed faintly under the moon. Children grew up with these tales, treating them as warnings, and carried them into adulthood. Outsiders dismissed such stories as superstition, but they matched patterns noticed decades earlier by those who had once lived on the island. For veterans of its service, the island remained part of their identity. They spoke of it with reluctance, their words careful, their silences even more telling. They described the monotony of life under constant supervision, the way friendships were forged quietly, the way individuality faded into routines. Some admitted they still dreamed of the island, of long corridors echoing with footsteps, of the metallic taste of air underground. Their testimonies gave the island depth beyond myth. It was not just a forbidden place, but a lived experience, one etched into bodies and memories. In cultural memory, the island became a mirror. Writers used it to symbolize secrecy, historians as a case study of ambition's hidden cost, filmmakers as a backdrop for haunting stories. Reality remained simpler, a contaminated zone, decaying quietly, too dangerous to enter, too costly to clean, and too bound to secrecy to be discussed openly. The Forbidden Island endured as both ruin and reminder, carrying its silence into the future. The Forbidden Island had now existed longer in silence than it ever had in use. Decades of secrecy had become its most enduring feature, outlasting the Cold War, outlasting the government that built it, and even outlasting the workers who once walked its corridors. For most people, it was now a name without detail, a place known only through rumour and shadow. Yet its outline across the sea still commanded unease. From the mainland, villagers continued to glance toward it cautiously, avoiding direct discussion. Silence had become their language of survival. In their stories, the island shifted between reality and ghostliness. They spoke of waters that never froze even in the coldest winters, of winds that changed direction without reason, of faint lights glimmering where no electricity should remain. Such tales blurred the line between fact and folklore, but they carried the weight of generations. For children, the island became a dare, a place to test courage by staring at its outline too long. For adults, it was a reminder of history that could not be escaped. Scientists pressed their warnings with more urgency. Studies showed isotopes spreading further into the sea, carried by currents beyond local waters. The findings suggested that contamination was not contained to the island alone, but had begun seeping quietly outward. Officials acknowledged these concerns only indirectly, promising reviews and monitoring but offering little transparency. The cost of cleanup was immense, the risks equally so, and so silence remained the preferred defense. Yet silence did not erase reality. Nature continued to reveal scars, forests with patches of twisted growth, soil where grass refused to take root, and animals behaving as though guided by instincts humans could not see. Even storms seemed different when they passed over the island, lightning striking more often, thunder echoing longer than on the mainland. Whether natural or not, these impressions deepened the sense that the island was unlike any other place. For those who had lived there long ago, the memories resurfaced sharply with age. They spoke of endless routines, of the heavy hum that filled the air, of the isolation that pressed against every thought. Some remembered it with pride, others with regret, but all agreed it was unforgettable. The island had marked them as deeply as it marked the land itself. In the cultural sphere, the island grew into a metaphor. Writers and filmmakers used it to symbolize the hidden costs of power, the weight of secrecy, and the way history lingers long after its moment has passed. The Forbidden Island endured, not as a fortress of science, but as a monument to silence, carrying its unanswered questions into yet another generation. By now, the Forbidden Island was less a place than a symbol, yet its physical presence remained undeniable. Across the water, its forests swayed in the wind, its broken towers jutted upward like teeth, and its shoreline revealed scars left by storms and erosion. What had once been an active fortress of secrecy was now a ruin, but one infused with danger that time could not erase. The sea carried whispers of its history, barrels buried in haste, chambers sealed without thought for the decades ahead, experiments that left traces woven into soil and air. Scientists who monitored the region continued to find irregularities, fluctuating isotope levels, shifting hotspots of contamination, and ecosystems marked by quiet distortion. Fish with pale, translucent markings, birds avoiding entire zones, forests growing in unnatural patterns. These details never reached the front pages, yet they circulated in scientific reports, each one confirming what locals had always believed. The island was not asleep, it was alive with what lingered. For villagers nearby, the island's presence shaped daily life. They passed warnings as naturally as traditions, instructing children never to sail too close, never to treat the island lightly, never to ask too many questions. Their stories blurred fact and myth, of glowing lights visible on stormy nights, of machinery still humming underground, of shadows walking along the shore long after midnight. These tales were not told to entertain but to protect, to keep distance between ordinary life and the weight of secrecy. Outsiders often dismiss such stories, but to those who lived in sight of the island, they were simply reality. For former workers, memories grew sharper with age. They described the endless routines, the silence enforced by duty, the sensation of being cut off from the world. They remembered the taste of metallic air in underground chambers, the fatigue that never faded, the uneasy awareness that their work carried risks they were not allowed to name. Some carried pride in their service, others carried regret, but all carried silence. Even when free to speak, they hesitated, as though the island itself still demanded secrecy. In culture, the island grew into legend. Writers and filmmakers used it as a canvas for stories of ambition, secrecy, and haunting. Internet discussions portrayed it as everything from a cursed wasteland to a laboratory still active in secret. Reality, though quieter, was no less haunting. A decaying site of nuclear ambition, dangerous to enter, impossible to erase, left suspended between memory and myth. The Forbidden Island endured as a monument to silence itself, a place where history was buried but never gone, where the past continued to breathe through the soil and the sea. As the years moved deeper into the 2020s, the Forbidden Island's reputation spread further than ever before. With technology allowing even the most remote landscapes to be studied from afar, its image appeared more often on screens and in reports, though never in official acknowledgements. Each glimpse reinforced the same impression: decay above, mystery below. Crumbling docks and rusting towers spoke of abandonment, but the silence surrounding what lay underground only deepened speculation. Environmentalists warned with increasing urgency. Rising seas and stronger storms, they said, threatened to breach storage sites never designed to withstand such pressures. Their findings hinted at contamination slowly spreading into wider waters, carried silently on currents. Some fish caught far from the island still bore traces of isotopes, evidence that the past had not remained confined. These warnings reached international audiences but were often overshadowed by politics. Governments spoke vaguely of ongoing monitoring and containment measures, yet avoided details. Silence remained the strongest barrier. For locals, little had changed. They still told stories of the island with the same careful distance as their parents and grandparents. Children were warned never to sail close, never to stare too long at its outline after dark, never to take the risk of testing the taboo. Fishermen continued to avoid the waters, steering wide even at the cost of longer journeys. They spoke of engines stalling mysteriously, of compasses spinning without cause, of a heaviness in the air that pressed against the skin. Such stories, passed from voice to voice, carried the weight of lived experience more than imagination. For those who once served there, the island remained part of their identity. They described the monotony of patrols, the hum of machinery that never truly stopped, the way time seemed to freeze inside its boundaries. They carried illnesses, fatigue, and memories shaped by secrecy, yet they rarely spoke fully. Silence had become part of them, as enduring as the scars left on the land itself. In cultural memory, the island grew into something larger than fact. Writers used it to explore themes of secrecy and decay. Filmmakers portrayed it as a haunted relic of human ambition, and online communities kept it alive with endless speculation. Some imagined hidden vaults still sealed beneath the ground. Others believed abandoned laboratories continued to glow faintly in darkness. Reality was quieter, yet more haunting. A decaying monument to secrecy, carrying invisible dangers into the present. The Forbidden Island, once the guarded heart of nuclear ambition, was now a reminder of how history never truly ends. It lingers, reshaping land, memory, and silence alike. The Forbidden Island stands today as one of the most enduring shadows of the Cold War. It was built on secrecy, shaped by ambition, and left behind as a monument to silence. For decades it drew people into its orbit, scientists, soldiers, workers, each bound by oaths, each living in routines that erased individuality in service of a greater design. Those people are mostly gone now, but the island remains, carrying their silence in its soil. From the mainland, it looks ordinary, a strip of forested land, waves breaking against its shore, towers sagging in decay. Yet appearances deceive. Beneath the surface lie the remains of experiments, chambers sealed and forgotten, storage sites that were never meant to last forever. Radiation lingers invisibly, a reminder that time cannot erase what was buried. Environmental studies warn of instability, of waste that may leak into the sea, of ecosystems already showing scars. Each warning echoes the truth villagers have known for generations. The island is not safe, and never has been. Locals continue to live with its shadow. They teach children to respect its silence, passing on stories of strange lights, stalled engines, and winds that seem to carry whispers. These tales are part caution, part memory, part folklore. Outsiders may dismiss them as superstition, but those who live in sight of the island know better. They understand that history can cling to land, shaping not only soil and water but the rhythm of daily life. For former workers, the island endures in memory. Some recall pride in serving, others regret for what was done, but all remember the weight of secrecy. Even when free to speak, many still hesitate, as though the island itself demands silence long after their departure. Their recollections confirm what outsiders sense, that the place is more than geography, it is presence. In culture, the island has become legend. It is invoked in films, novels, and debates, often exaggerated but always rooted in truth. It symbolizes the dangers of ambition unchecked, the costs of secrecy, and the way history refuses to vanish. As the decades continue, the island remains, caught between abandonment and endurance. Its forests grow over ruins, its shores shift with storms, yet beneath those changes lies permanence. The Forbidden Island is not only a relic of the past, but a reminder for the future. It shows how power built on silence leaves marks deeper than steel or stone, marks that outlast governments and generations alike. And so it waits, silent, dangerous, and unresolved, an unfinished chapter of history resting on the water's edge, where memory and myth intertwine.